Welcome to the Wild Crone Wisdom podcast with your host Vinutha Mohan. In this episode, we understand that the ego is a very useful and essential part of being human and how to befriend it rather than resist it. Ego has been getting so much bad press in recent years. The popular cliche in New Age spirituality is all about getting rid of the ego, dissolving the ego, transcending the ego, and becoming egoless. One Zen master says the essence of Zen is no self, no problem. But is it ever possible to dissolve your ego? And is it even healthy for you? At the very basic level, the ego gives us a sense of separateness to become aware of our physical, psychological, and energetic boundaries between us and others. How would we feel in the absence of such a capacity? For instance, an infant has no ego and no awareness of its separateness from its mother. It has a symbiotic relationship with its caregiver. Similarly, an elderly person with advanced Alzheimer's or dementia has no sense of self either. Neither the infant nor the elderly patient can take care of themselves, protect themselves, or live an independent life without a caregiver. But they have no ego. Is that what we mean when we say we want to be egoless? At a very fundamental level, we need the ego to give us a sense of boundary in order for us to function in the world. So let us not try to get rid of this valuable function of our psyche. So then what do we mean when we say the ego is a problem? The spiritual teacher, Adya Shanti, has by far the most brilliant and useful interpretation of the ego for me. Adya invites us to look at the ego as a function. The ego as a functional entity is navigating between the external world and the inner world of the psyche. In the inner world, its job is to learn how to navigate the content of the psyche with its thoughts, beliefs, emotions, and patterns. The ego is not the producer of your psychological world, but a recipient of it. The content of your psyche bubbles up from both the personal and collective unconscious, and the ego has no control over it. The problem arises when the ego merges with the content and takes on an identity based on it. Then we judge ourselves from the content over which we don't have any control and make it into a problem. Our thoughts and emotions bubble up from the unconscious, and the only power we have is to teach our ego effective functional strategies on how to relate and respond to this content. In psychotherapy, we call the strategy parts work. In parts work, we separate the executive self or true self from its parts or subpersonalities, and we teach self-leadership to the executive self. In Vedic scriptures, we call this executive self the intellect, buddhi, and the content of the psyche, mind, manas. When we teach the ego strategies for unmerging with the content of the psyche, then we are strengthening the discriminating consciousness of the ego. This is the healthy use of the ego. Let us see how we can apply this to a real life situation. Imagine a child growing up in a family where emotions were considered a weakness and a liability. This family perhaps shames a child for crying or feeling fear or needing any kind of emotional support. Such a child might grow up with an ego identity that I am all alone and I have to fend for myself. As an adult, this child may become an overachiever, strong, resilient, successful at work, but without any real connections, friendships, and may also have found ways to numb their feelings with substances. In this case, this person may be made up of multiple parts, such as an emotionally orphaned child, an overachiever, a perfectionist, a shamed child, an addict, a loner, and so on. The common mistake an ego makes is to merge with all these parts of the psyche and make an identity of it by saying to oneself, I'm a go-getter with no needs and vulnerability will be my downfall. This is how a merged ego state might look like, and this merged ego creates trouble for us. But if we can teach the ego to develop a compassionate relationship with the feelings of shame, fear, perfectionism, loneliness, and how to manage it without trying to control or numb it, then the ego transforms from an identity to a functional capacity to discern, engage, and respond effectively to these feelings and needs. Using our discriminating intellect in this way, we teach ourselves to slowly disassemble our fixed identity that the ego created within our psyche. In parts work, we call this unburdening or unmerging. As we learn to do this effectively and consistently, then the ego becomes a capacity for discernment and not an entity. It is by using this capacity that we can realize that we are not our body, our thoughts, our emotions, our beliefs, our stories, our perceptions, and so on. So, perhaps we need to reframe the no self as no fixed self. As we teach the ego to slowly unmerge from the contents of the psyche, the ego becomes hollowed out more and more. This is what we then refer to as an egoless ego, says Adya. Such hollowed out ego becomes filled with consciousness. What then remains is the ego's healthy and very useful capacity to discern, this is me and that is you. Without this capacity, we will not be able to function and navigate this world. In Buddhism, this ego's capacity for discernment is represented by the symbol of Manjushri, the bodhisattva holding a sword. The sword symbolizes the discriminating consciousness. However, one has to be careful to not just leave it at that. With only a strong sense of discernment, we can tend to get overly rational and detached. So we need to balance this discerning intellect with an open heart filled with compassion. This open-hearted compassion is represented by the image of Kuan Yin, the bodhisattva of compassion. This capacity to understand the impersonal nature of human suffering, combined with the open-hearted compassion for such suffering, is what brings forth the Buddha, Christ, or Krishna consciousness from within. This is how we use the ego to transcend the ego and then come back to serve and help others. Then we can embody what Brene calls a strong back, a soft front, and a wild heart. So let us thank and embrace our friend ego, who, when taught well and empowered with the right tools and strategies, can bring us such spiritual gifts to us while keeping us safe and boundaried. So maybe the goal isn't to get rid of the ego, but to help it mature, to teach it how to serve awareness instead of protecting our wounds. When the ego learns to unmerge from our stories and meet our pain with compassion, it stops being a cage and becomes a doorway. A strong ego doesn't mean a big ego. It means one that's flexible, discerning, and kind. One that can hold boundaries and open its heart. That's how we transcend the ego. Not by erasing it, but by transforming it into a vessel for presence, love, and wisdom. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Wild Crone Wisdom with your host, Vinutha Mohan. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist from the Bay Area, California, specializing in trauma and attachment repair. I'm also a certified EMDR specialist and a certified shamanic practitioner. In this podcast series, we delve into the journey of our spiritual essence having a human experience. While many social scientists study human emotions, thoughts, and behaviors, and others explore transcendental experiences, few bridge the gap to help embody the spiritual wisdom in everyday life. I call this the psycho-spiritual path. Through this podcast, I hope to share bite-sized practical insights for navigating life as an empowered sovereign being. If you found this episode valuable, we'd greatly appreciate your support. Please consider rating, reviewing, commenting, and subscribing on your podcast platform to help us reach a wider audience. You can explore more of my writings on Medium by following the link in the show notes. We'd also love to hear about your experience, so feel free to share your thoughts with us at wildcronewisdompodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for being part of our journey. Please be advised, the information provided in the Wild Crone Wisdom podcast is intended for general information purposes only. Vinutha Mohan is a licensed therapist and healer. However, the content shared in this podcast does not replace or constitute professional advice, therapy, or counseling. It is essential to consult with a qualified mental health professional for personalized guidance regarding your unique circumstances. Thank you.